Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Evelyn Marchette, and 6 months ago, I never would have believed that consciousness could survive in places where it shouldn't exist. I was a cognitive neuroscientist specializing in memory formation and spatial navigation, the kind of researcher who built entire careers on quantifiable data and peer-reviewed publications. My work at the Kellerman Institute focused on how the human brain constructs mental maps of physical spaces, how we orient ourselves in the world, how we remember where we've been and anticipate where we're going. It was precise, measurable work, clean work, the kind of science that made sense. That changed when I received the recruitment email from a sender, identified only as Cartography Division, Internal Projects. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, wedged between notifications about grant rejections and departmental meeting reminders. Subject line: Consultation opportunity, classified navigation research. The body was brief, almost terse. My expertise in spatial cognition had been noted. A private research initiative required consultation on environmental orientation challenges in non-standard geometries. The compensation listed was more than my annual salary at the Institute. Travel and accommodation provided. 3-week commitment, potentially extending to 6 months depending on initial findings. Contact information for a project coordinator named Silas Drummond. I should have been more suspicious. The timing alone should have given me pause. This arrived 2 days after I'd learned my primary research grant wouldn't be renewed, that the university was restructuring my department, that my position might not exist beyond the fiscal year. I was 37 years old with a publication record that impressed other academics but meant nothing to budget committees. My apartment lease was month to month because I couldn't afford the security deposit for anything better. My father's care facility had started sending payment reminder notices with increasing urgency. So when the email promised enough money to solve 6 months of problems simultaneously, I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I replied within an hour. Drummond responded within 10 minutes, which should have been my second warning. Nobody in legitimate research responds that quickly unless they're desperate or the opportunity isn't legitimate at all. He provided coordinates rather than an address. 39. 7,392 degrees N, 104, 9,903 degrees W, and instructions to arrive no later than April 3rd. A digital signature would be required before any project details could be discussed. Standard confidentiality protocols, he assured me, common in private sector research. The coordinates placed the location somewhere in the Denver metro area, which seemed reasonable enough. I'd worked on classified projects before, mostly Department of Defense contracts studying how soldiers navigate in GPS-denied environments. The secrecy was familiar, almost comforting in its bureaucratic familiarity. I spent the week before departure trying to research the project through back channels. The few colleagues I trusted enough to ask hadn't heard of any cartography division, but that meant little in the fragmented landscape of private research funding. One friend mentioned she'd been approached for similar consultation work years ago, something about perceptual mapping in industrial facilities, but had declined because the terms felt wrong somehow. She couldn't articulate why. Just a feeling that the project existed in some gray space between legitimate research and something else. They weren't interested in my methodology, she told me over coffee the day before I left. They just wanted me to observe and document, like they already knew what was happening but needed someone with credentials to witness it. I should have listened more carefully to that distinction. The flight to Denver was unremarkable, the kind of compressed air tedium that characterizes modern air travel. I rented a car at the airport, a nondescript sedan that smelled of chemical air freshener and previous travelers' fast food. The GPS guided me away from the city center, past the sprawling suburbs with their identical strip malls and housing developments, toward an area where urban planning gradually surrendered to something older and less organized. The coordinates led to an industrial zone that felt suspended in an economic depression from decades past. Warehouses with broken windows, empty parking lots where weeds pushed through asphalt cracks. A few businesses still operated, auto body shops, a scrap metal yard, a distributor for restaurant supplies. But they had the air of survivors rather than successes, hanging on through inertia rather than profitability. The specific building wasn't marked with any signage. It was a 4-story structure of gray concrete and narrow windows, architecturally indistinguishable from the warehouses surrounding it, except for the newness of its security infrastructure. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, cameras mounted at regular intervals, a guard station at the single entrance, staffed by a young man in a private security uniform who checked my identification against a tablet before allowing me through. The parking lot contained 7 vehicles, all of them similarly anonymous rental sedans or unmarked vans. No corporate logos, no indication of who owned the facility or what occurred inside, just blank concrete and watching cameras. Drummond met me at the interior entrance, beyond the security checkpoint where I'd been required to surrender my phone, laptop, and any recording devices. He was shorter than I'd imagined from his emails, perhaps 5'7", with the kind of precisely groomed appearance that suggested military background. Close-cropped graying hair, pressed khakis, a polo shirt with a breast pocket but no identifying marks. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, his smile pleasant without reaching his eyes. "Dr. Marchette, thank you for making the trip." His voice was carefully neutral, the studied lack of regional accent that comes from either training or a lifetime of deliberate self-editing. "I apologize for the security protocols, but I'm sure you understand the necessity." I nodded, though I didn't understand at all. Not yet. He guided me through corridors painted in institutional beige, fluorescent lights humming overhead with that particular frequency that seems designed to prevent clear thought. We passed several closed doors marked only with numbers. Through one open doorway, I glimpsed what appeared to be a standard office space: desks, computers, filing cabinets. Everything aggressively ordinary. "Before we discuss the project specifics, I need you to review and sign the NDA," Drummond said, as we entered a small conference room. A leather portfolio waited on the table, along with a cup of coffee that was still steaming. Someone had been monitoring my arrival closely enough to time the coffee's preparation. The non-disclosure agreement was 63 pages long. I'm embarrassed to admit I didn't read it thoroughly. The key terms seemed standard enough: prohibitions on discussing project details, penalties for information disclosure, binding arbitration for disputes. The compensation structure was outlined in an appendix: $40,000 for the initial 3-week consultation, with substantial bonuses for extended participation. A relocation stipend if I chose to stay beyond the trial period. Health insurance better than what the Institute provided. I signed. Drummond witnessed the signature, then countersigned himself before placing the document in a locked briefcase. Excellent, now we can talk properly. He poured himself coffee from a carafe I hadn't noticed, then settled into the chair across from me. What I'm about to tell you will sound implausible. I ask that you withhold judgment until you've seen the facility. The phrasing struck me as odd. Not the project or the research, but the facility, as though the building itself was the phenomenon requiring study. In 1973, Drummond began. A subsidiary of Morrison Vale Industries purchased this property for use as a storage depot for industrial equipment. The building was constructed according to standard specifications for warehouse facilities of that era. 4 floors, reinforced concrete construction, total floor space of approximately 200,000 square feet. Nothing unusual in the architectural plans, nothing remarkable about the construction process. He paused to sip his coffee, and I noticed his hand remained perfectly steady. Whatever he was about to tell me, he'd told it before. Many times, perhaps. Approximately 6 months after construction was completed, workers began reporting navigation difficulties. They'd enter on the ground floor and become disoriented trying to locate specific storage areas. Some claimed the corridors seemed longer than they should be. Others reported arriving at destinations through routes they didn't remember taking. At first, management attributed this to the building's size and the similar appearance of different sections. That's not uncommon, I said. Institutional spaces often create orientation challenges. Repeated visual patterns, insufficient landmarks, poor wayfinding design. Yes, that was the initial assessment. Drummond's expression remained neutral, but the difficulties persisted even after they installed directional signage, color-coded sections, and posted floor plans throughout the building. In fact, the problem seemed to worsen. Workers would follow signs pointing to one location and arrive somewhere else entirely. The floor plans appeared to show corridors that didn't exist, or omitted corridors that clearly did exist. I waited. This was still within the realm of architectural incompetence or perceptual confusion. Morrison Vale brought in spatial consultants. They conducted surveys, verified measurements, compared the structure to the original blueprints. Everything matched. The building was exactly what it was supposed to be, but people couldn't navigate it reliably. After 3 employees vanished for multiple hours, they claimed to have been walking the corridors the entire time, but couldn't explain where they'd been. The company ceased operations at this facility. What happened to the employees? I asked. They were evaluated psychologically. No shared history of mental illness, no drugs or alcohol in their systems, no signs of conspiracy or deliberate deception. They simply couldn't account for the missing time or explain where they'd been within a building that, according to measurements, contained no space for them to be lost in. Drummond opened the briefcase and removed a slim folder, which he placed on the table between us. Morrison Vale maintained ownership of the property but left it vacant for 31 years. During that time, there were occasional reports from security patrols or urban explorers who entered the building illegally. Stories about corridors that seemed endless, rooms that appeared and disappeared, sounds of footsteps that never drew closer or farther away. The usual folklore that accumulates around abandoned buildings. You don't believe it was just folklore. In 2004, the property was acquired by a research collective interested in spatial anomalies. They documented the navigation difficulties systematically. Teams equipped with GPS devices, laser measuring tools, and recording equipment entered the structure. The GPS devices failed to function properly inside. The measurements didn't remain consistent across multiple surveys. The recordings captured audio of team members communicating, but the voices seemed to come from impossible directions, sometimes from team members who claimed they hadn't spoken. The coffee had gone cold in my cup. Outside the conference room, I could hear the muted sounds of footsteps in the corridor, voices too distant to distinguish words. "What you're describing sounds like equipment malfunction," I said, "or environmental interference with electronic devices." That was investigated extensively. The equipment functioned normally outside the building. The moment it crossed the threshold, navigational tools became unreliable. Not broken, not completely non-functional, but imprecise, as though the building existed in a relationship to space that standard measurement couldn't fully capture. Drummond opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be architectural drawings. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they were attempts to map the same structure multiple times, and none of the versions matched. Corridors appeared in different configurations. Stairwells occupied different positions. Some versions showed the building as 4 stories, others as 5 or 6. The layouts contradicted each other in fundamental ways. "These are surveys conducted over a 12-year period," Drummond explained. "Different teams, different methodologies, different equipment. No 2 surveys produced identical results. The building appears to be variable, not in any physical sense we can measure directly, but in how it presents itself to observation." "That's not possible," I said, though my voice carried less certainty than I intended. "No," Drummond agreed. "It shouldn't be possible, but it is what we've documented consistently. Which brings us to why you're here, Dr. Marchette. Your research on how the brain constructs spatial maps, how we create cognitive representations of our environment. That's directly relevant to understanding what's happening in this building. We need to know if the phenomenon is in the structure itself, or in how human consciousness interacts with the structure." I looked at the contradictory maps spread across the table. Each one had been prepared with professional precision, complete with measurements and scale notations. Each one claimed to represent objective reality. Each one was incompatible with the others. "You want me to go inside?" I said. "I want you to experience it firsthand. We've had cognitive researchers before, but none with your specific expertise in spatial navigation and memory formation. We need documentation of how the building affects the process of creating mental maps. What happens to your sense of orientation? How your memory of the route changes over time? Whether you can recognize patterns in the inconsistency." "Has anyone been hurt?" I asked. "In the current research phase, I mean." Drummond hesitated for the first time since we'd begun talking. It was brief, perhaps half a second, but I caught it. "We've had some incidents. Researchers who spent extended periods inside sometimes report lingering perceptual distortions after leaving. Difficulty with normal navigation, a sense that ordinary spaces contain more than they should. These effects have always been temporary." "How temporary?" "Most subjects return to baseline within 2 to 6 weeks. A few have taken longer." "And the ones who took longer, are they all right now?" Another hesitation. "Mostly." The word hung in the air between us. Mostly. Not entirely, not all of them. I should have walked out then. Should have demanded an immediate return of my signed NDA, claimed I didn't understand what I was agreeing to, threatened legal action if necessary. Any rational person would have recognized this was wrong. Not just scientifically implausible, but fundamentally unsafe. But I thought of my father in the care facility, the bills I couldn't pay, the career that was dissolving beneath me. I thought of $40,000 for 3 weeks of work. I thought of how I'd spent 15 years studying how the brain navigates space, and here was a space that apparently refused to be navigated properly. Professional curiosity is a powerful thing. It can make you rationalize dangers you know you should avoid. What would the initial consultation involve? I asked. Drummond's expression relaxed slightly, though I realized he'd never actually appeared tense. 3 weeks of daily observation sessions. You'd enter the building with safety protocols, tethered rope system, radio contact, time limits. You'd attempt to navigate according to specific instructions, documenting your subjective experience and any cognitive difficulties. We'd conduct neurological monitoring before and after each session, looking for changes in brain activity related to spatial processing. And if I want to stop at any point, you leave. No penalties, full payment for whatever time you've completed. The NDA remains in force, but we're not interested in keeping anyone here against their will. The research is only valuable if you're a willing, reliable observer. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me wonder how many previous consultants had exercised that option, and what they'd experienced that made them leave. I'd like to see the building before I commit to the full consultation period, I said. Drummond nodded as though he'd expected this. Of course. I can take you to the ground floor entry point now if you'd like, just to get a sense of what we're working with. He stood, and I followed him back into the corridor. We passed more numbered doors, took 2 turns that felt like they should have brought us back to where we'd started but didn't, and arrived at a heavy steel door marked with yellow and black hazard striping. A security keypad beside it blinked green. This is the controlled access point, Drummond explained. The building's main entrance is sealed. We use this doorway because it provides the most consistent entry topology. Even so, what's on the other side isn't always the same. What do you mean, not always the same? You'll see. He entered a code on the keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy click. Ready. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. Drummond opened the door. The space beyond was a corridor, approximately 8 feet wide and perhaps 30 feet long, ending in a T-junction. Gray concrete walls, fluorescent lighting and fixtures that looked original to the 1973 construction, linoleum flooring in a pattern of alternating gray and white tiles. Everything utterly ordinary, almost aggressively mundane. Except for the silence. The moment the door opened, I became aware of how much ambient sound the entrance facility had contained. The hum of ventilation systems, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of voices and footsteps. All of it stopped at the threshold. The corridor beyond absorbed sound in a way that felt wrong, as though the air itself was different, denser somehow. Notice anything unusual? Drummond asked. I stepped closer to the doorway, careful not to cross the threshold yet. The corridor's perspective looked slightly wrong, though I couldn't immediately articulate why. The parallel lines of the walls should have converged toward a vanishing point, but they seemed to maintain their width too long or converge too quickly, or I blinked, trying to reset my visual processing. The wrongness remained. The perspective isn't consistent, I said. Good, that's one of the most common initial observations. The geometry reads as normal to any measurement device, but human visual perception registers something off. We've had artists try to sketch what they see. The drawings never quite work. Parallel lines that shouldn't be possible in Euclidean space. I pulled out the small notebook I'd brought with me. They'd allowed paper and pen after confiscating electronic devices. I attempted to sketch the corridor to capture that sense of wrongness. But as my hand moved across the page, I found myself making corrections, adjusting lines, trying to force the image to make sense. The final sketch looked like a normal corridor. The wrongness refused to translate to paper. "Everyone has that experience," Drummond said quietly. "The anomaly exists in perception but resists documentation. Recording equipment captures what appears to be a normal building. Human observers experience something else. That's part of what makes this phenomenon so difficult to study." "Has anyone mapped the neural correlates?" I asked. "Brain scans of people while they're experiencing the perceptual distortion." "We've tried. The scanning equipment needs to be outside the building, which means using portable EEG or other devices with limited spatial resolution. The results have been ambiguous. Some indication of unusual activity in the posterior parietal cortex and retrosplenial complex, areas involved in spatial navigation and scene recognition, but nothing definitive." I stared into the corridor. The silence felt like a presence, something actively absorbing rather than merely the absence of sound. I could see the T-junction at the far end, 2 directions to choose from, left or right. A simple binary decision, but I found myself uncertain about which direction I'd choose if I entered. Both seemed equally possible. Both seemed like they might lead to the same place or nowhere at all. "How many people have gone missing inside?" I asked suddenly. Drummond's pause was longer this time. "Define missing." "People who went in and didn't come out, or came out significantly later than they should have, or came out changed in some way that indicates they experienced something beyond normal disorientation." In the modern research phase, we've had 4 incidents where subjects were unaccounted for beyond the expected duration of their observation sessions. The longest was 11 hours. All 4 eventually emerged at the access point, reporting that they'd been walking continuously and attempting to return. Their perception was that they'd been inside for the expected duration, never more than 90 minutes. The time discrepancy only became apparent when they checked their watches or asked about the time. 11 hours, I repeated, and they thought it was 90 minutes. Subjective time inside the building appears to become decoupled from external time in ways we don't yet understand. Not always, not predictably, but it happens with enough frequency that we've had to implement strict protocols. No observation session exceeds 1 hour by the external clock, regardless of the subject's perception of elapsed time. Radio check-ins every 5 minutes. If contact is lost for more than 10 minutes, we send an extraction team. Has an extraction team ever had trouble finding someone? Another pause, longer this time. "Twice," Drummond said finally. "In both cases, the subject was eventually located, but not where they should have been according to their described route. One case involved a researcher who was supposed to be on the ground floor. We found her on what appeared to be a 3rd floor, though she insisted she'd only walked down, never up. Appeared to be a 3rd floor. The building is officially 4 stories, but people sometimes report levels that don't correspond to the standard floor plan. Basement levels where the blueprints show none. Upper stories beyond the 4th floor. Intermediate floors between the numbered levels. When we go looking for these spaces after the fact, we don't find them. But in the moment, they seem to exist." I tried to imagine what that meant. A building whose internal geography was somehow subjective, different for each person who entered, or perhaps changing over time, the architecture itself fluid in ways that violated every principle of physics and material science I understood. I need to think about this, I said, stepping back from the doorway. Drummond nodded and closed the door. The lock engaged with another heavy click. The moment the door sealed, ambient sound returned, ventilation, lights, the subtle acoustic signature of normal space. I hadn't realized how much the silence from the corridor had been pressing against my ears until it disappeared. "Take whatever time you need," Drummond said. "You have access to the entrance facility for the next 3 days. I've arranged temporary housing at a hotel nearby. Review the documentation, ask questions, make your decision. If you choose to leave, we'll process your departure with no issues." He provided me with a security badge, room key, and a thin binder of research summaries. Then he escorted me back through the facility to the parking lot. The afternoon sun was bright after the fluorescent interior, making me squint. I sat in my rental car for perhaps 10 minutes before starting the engine, staring at the blank concrete face of the building. 4 stories tall, approximately 200,000 square feet, constructed in 1973, abandoned shortly after completion, impossible to navigate reliably, dangerous in ways that remained unclear. I should have driven directly to the airport. Instead, I drove to the hotel Drummond had arranged, a mid-tier chain property that catered to business travelers and families visiting nearby attractions. My room was on the 3rd floor, clean and anonymous, with a view of the parking lot and a gas station across the street. I ordered delivery food I barely tasted and spent the evening reading through the research documentation. The binder contained 23 incident reports, each describing an observation session where something unexpected had occurred. Some were minor, a researcher reporting that the corridors felt longer than they appeared, or noticing that rooms seemed to have different numbers of windows when viewed from inside versus outside. Others were more disturbing. One report, dated 8 months prior, described a cognitive psychologist named Dr. Isabel Kerrigan, who'd spent 45 minutes inside the building attempting to map a single corridor. According to her testimony, she'd walked in a straight line, maintaining visual contact with both her entry point and the corridor ahead. She'd counted her steps, 217 of them. But when she turned around, her entry point was still visible, still the same distance away it had been when she started. She'd walked back, and it took 12 steps to reach the door. The space I crossed did not correspond to the space I had to recross, her report stated. I traversed different distances in opposite directions along what should have been the same path. This is not possible in conventional geometry. Another report detailed an experiment where 2 researchers entered the building simultaneously through the same door, maintaining radio contact. They'd been instructed to turn left at the first junction, then proceed straight for 50 paces before turning right. Both reported following these instructions exactly. Both emerged at the same access door, but they'd never encountered each other inside. According to their descriptions, they'd been in completely different corridors, despite supposedly walking identical routes. The most disturbing report came from 9 months ago. A structural engineer named Marcus Welland had entered the building to conduct measurements of wall thickness and ceiling height. Standard procedure, non-controversial work. He'd been equipped with a laser measuring device and a radio. Contact was maintained for 17 minutes, during which he reported normal readings, 8-foot corridors, 9-foot ceilings, 18-inch concrete walls. Everything consistent with the original construction specs. Then his radio transmissions became confused. He reported that the ceiling had lowered to 7 feet, then 6. The walls were closing in, he said. The corridor was narrowing, but his measurements still showed the same 8-foot width, the same 9-foot ceiling height. The numbers said everything was normal. His perception insisted otherwise. He'd requested extraction. The team found him 33 minutes later, external time, sitting in a corner with his arms wrapped around his knees, hyperventilating. The corridor around him measured exactly as it should have. But Welland insisted he'd spent hours in a space that was crushing him slowly, that the measurements were lying, that the building was wrong in ways instruments couldn't detect. He'd required 3 weeks of psychological treatment before returning to normal function. He'd never entered the building again. I closed the binder and sat on the hotel bed, listening to the ambient noise of traffic and other guests in adjacent rooms. Normal sounds, normal space, the world behaving according to predictable rules. Why would anyone willingly enter a building that seemed to operate according to different rules? What possible scientific value could justify the risk? But I knew the answer, because the building shouldn't exist. Because if it did exist, if the reports were accurate, then everything we understood about space and perception, and the relationship between consciousness and physical reality was incomplete, maybe fundamentally wrong. A building that couldn't be mapped consistently, a structure where distance became subjective, a place where time dilated or compressed without any relativistic explanation. If any of this was real, and the documentation suggested it was, then this was the most significant spatial phenomenon anyone had ever documented. I thought about my research. 15 years studying how the hippocampus constructs cognitive maps, how the brain represents spatial relationships, how memory and navigation intertwine. I'd published 47 papers on the subject. I'd built computational models of how neurons fire to encode location and direction. I'd been so certain I understood how spatial cognition worked. And here was a place that apparently refused to be cognized properly. I didn't sleep well that night. My dreams were full of corridors that stretched and compressed, of rooms that existed in multiple places simultaneously, of doorways that led to themselves in endless loops. I woke 3 times, disoriented in the dark hotel room, needing several seconds to remember where I was and how I'd gotten there. Morning arrived gray and overcast. I showered, dressed, forced myself to eat breakfast at the hotel's continental buffet. Then I drove back to the facility. Drummond was waiting in the conference room with fresh coffee and a tablet displaying what appeared to be a consent form. "Have you made your decision?" he asked. I should have said no. Should have explained that the risks outweighed any potential benefit, that no amount of money justified exposing myself to a phenomenon that had broken multiple previous researchers, that this entire project existed in some ethical gray area I wanted no part of. Instead, I said, I want to start with short sessions, 15 minutes maximum with continuous radio contact. I document my subjective experience in real time. We do neurological monitoring before and after. If I report any significant perceptual distortion, I exit immediately. Drummond smiled slightly. Those are exactly the protocols we'd planned to use. Welcome to the project, Dr. Marchette. I signed the consent form on the tablet. My signature appeared in digital ink, looking nothing like my actual handwriting, as though even this simple act of identity confirmation was being distorted by proximity to the building. 2 hours later, I was being fitted with a safety harness connected to a climbing rope rated for rescue operations, a radio clipped to my shoulder, a small camera mounted on my chest. Drummond and 2 technicians monitored me from the control room adjacent to the access door. "We'll maintain visual contact via the camera feed," Drummond explained through the radio. "Radio check every 60 seconds. You'll follow a simple route, straight ahead to the T-junction, turn left, proceed to the next junction, turn around and return. Should take approximately 5 minutes if walked at a normal pace. We pull you out at 15 minutes regardless of where you are." "Understood," I said. One of the technicians attached sensors to my scalp, a portable EEG system that would record my brain activity throughout the session. Another technician checked the rope attachment, tugging it firmly to verify the connection points. "Ready when you are, Doctor," Drummond said. I approached the door, the same yellow and black hazard striping, the same keypad blinking green. One of the technicians entered the code and the lock disengaged. The door opened. The corridor beyond looked exactly as it had the day before. Gray concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, alternating gray and white floor tiles. The T-junction 30 feet ahead. Everything ordinary except for that persistent sense of wrong perspective, the way parallel lines seemed to follow rules that weren't quite Euclidean. And the silence, that dense, absorbing silence that made the air feel thicker than it should be. "Entering now," I said into the radio. I crossed the threshold. The change was immediate but subtle. Not a sudden shift in my surroundings, but rather a change in how I related to those surroundings. My sense of orientation, usually so reliable, that unconscious certainty about where I was and how to get where I was going, became uncertain. Not gone, but slippery, as though my mental map of the space kept trying to form but couldn't quite solidify. "Radio check," Drummond's voice said in my ear. "How do you feel?" "Disoriented, but not severely. Visual perception is slightly off, proceeding to the T-junction." I walked forward, counting my steps. The rope paid out behind me, a physical tether to the world outside the corridor. 23 steps brought me to the junction. I looked left, then right. Both directions appeared identical, same width, same lighting, same floor tiles extending into the distance. "Turning left as instructed," I said. I turned left. The corridor ahead looked exactly like the one I just left. Same distance to what appeared to be another junction. Same concrete walls. But something felt different. The quality of the light, perhaps, or the way sound was absorbed. My footsteps made no echo at all, as though each step was being swallowed by the floor itself. I walked forward, still counting. 34 steps to the next junction. I should have been maintaining a consistent pace, covering roughly the same distance per step, but the junction seemed to arrive faster than it should have. Or perhaps I'd walked faster than I realized. My sense of time was becoming unreliable. "Turning around now," I reported, returning to entry point. I turned 180 degrees. The corridor behind me, the one I just walked down, was empty. The T-junction I'd turned from was visible in the distance. Everything looked correct, but I felt a spike of uncertainty, a sudden conviction that this wasn't the same corridor I'd entered from, that somehow in the act of turning around I'd rotated into a different version of the same space. I started walking back, 20 steps, 30, 40. The T-junction didn't seem to be getting closer. I stopped, looked behind me. The junction I'd turned around at was still visible, still the same apparent distance away. 50 steps, 60. The T-junction ahead remained distant. "Dr. Marchette," Drummond's voice came through the radio. "Your position readings are inconsistent. The camera feed shows you moving, but GPS isn't registering displacement. Are you making progress toward the entry point?" "I'm walking," I said, hearing the tension in my own voice. "But the junction isn't getting closer." "Stop walking. Remain stationary. We're pulling you back via the rope." I stopped, stood still in the middle of the corridor. The rope behind me began to move, pulling me backward. I didn't resist, letting myself be drawn like a hooked fish toward the surface. The sensation was wrong. I was moving backward. I could feel it, could see the floor tiles sliding past beneath me. But the T-junction ahead didn't change position. Neither did the junction behind me. I was being pulled through space that somehow wasn't translating to change in position, as though distance itself had become decorative rather than functional. Then, abruptly, I was at the T-junction, then at the entry corridor, then crossing the threshold back into the access room. The technicians caught me, steadied me. The door closed. Ambient sound rushed back. Ventilation, electronics, human voices. The world snapped back into being normal in a way that made my knees weak. "How long was I inside?" I asked. Drummond checked his tablet. 4 minutes 37 seconds. It had felt like at least 15, perhaps 20. They removed the EEG sensors, disconnected the camera, unclipped the rope. I sat down heavily in a chair while one of the technicians brought me water. My hands were shaking slightly, though I wasn't sure if it was from fear or excitement. "The camera feed showed you walking normally," Drummond said, reviewing footage on his tablet. "Consistent pace, straight line, but the rope telemetry was strange. You should have used approximately 100 feet of rope based on your described route. The system logged 73 feet paid out, but you reported walking what should have been closer to 200 feet worth of steps." "The space wasn't consistent," I said. "Forward and backward weren't symmetrical. I crossed more distance going in than I needed to cross coming back." "That's consistent with previous reports. We call it differential topology. The space seems to have different properties depending on direction of travel or intention. A corridor can be long when you want it to be short, or short when you're trying to traverse it fully." I drank the water. My pulse was elevated but steadying. The disorientation was fading, my sense of normal space reasserting itself. But I could still remember that feeling of walking without approaching, of distance becoming meaningless. "I want to see the EEG data," I said. One of the technicians pulled up the recordings on a laptop. The waveforms showed normal activity at baseline, then marked changes during the observation session. My theta rhythms, oscillations associated with spatial navigation, had become irregular, losing their usual frequency coherence. The place cells in my hippocampus should have been firing in sequence as I moved through space, creating the neural basis for my cognitive map. Instead, the activity looked scrambled, as though my brain couldn't decide what location I occupied, or how different locations related to each other. "This is remarkable," I murmured, studying the data. "The navigational systems are active but functionally disrupted. My brain was trying to create a spatial map but couldn't maintain consistency, like trying to remember a route while the route keeps changing." "Can you map it?" Drummond asked. Can you create a stable cognitive representation of the building despite the inconsistencies? That was the core question, wasn't it? Not whether the building was strange, but whether human consciousness could adapt to its strangeness. Whether the brain's spatial systems could learn to navigate a space that refused to be mapped by conventional means. I don't know, I said honestly, but I'd like to try again. Over the following 3 days, I conducted 11 more observation sessions, each carefully documented and monitored. The sessions varied in duration from 6 to 19 minutes, external time. My subjective experience of duration never matched the clock. Sometimes 15 minutes felt like 5. Sometimes 8 minutes stretched into what felt like half an hour. The building revealed itself gradually, like a puzzle that changed shape each time I thought I understood the pattern. In the third session, I discovered that the corridors had a kind of memory. I walked the same route I'd attempted in the first session, straight to the T-junction, left turn, proceed to the next junction. This time, when I turned around, the return journey took exactly as many steps as the forward journey. The space had become symmetrical, as though it had learned what I expected and decided to accommodate me. But in the fourth session, using a different route, the asymmetry returned with a vengeance. I walked what felt like 100 yards down a corridor that my step count suggested was only 40 feet long. When I turned around, the corridor had shortened to perhaps 20 feet. The rope telemetry confirmed it. I'd used 93 feet of rope going forward, 31 feet coming back, traversing what appeared visually to be the same distance. It's responsive, I told Drummond during our evening debrief. Not predictably, not in any way I can model yet, but the building seems to react to expectation or intention. When I walked the same route a second time with confidence, expecting it to be straightforward, it was straightforward. When I entered uncertain or trying to measure carefully, the space became unstable. Do you think it's conscious? One of the technicians asked, a woman named Sarah Ortiz who managed the monitoring equipment. The way you're describing it sounds almost intentional. I don't know if consciousness is the right framework, I said. It could be something about how observation affects topology in this space. Quantum systems behave differently when measured versus unmeasured. Maybe this building exists in some state where human intention or attention collapses spatial probability into specific configurations. Drummond made notes on his tablet. Have you noticed any lasting effects, changes in how you perceive normal space? I had. The hotel room had begun to feel subtly wrong, though I couldn't articulate how. The distance from the bed to the bathroom seemed variable depending on how much I was paying attention. The parking lot outside appeared to have more rows of cars than I remembered, or fewer, depending on when I looked. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could prove, just a persistent sense that ordinary space had become less fixed than it used to be. Minor perceptual drift, I admitted. Nothing I'd consider concerning yet. How long before I should worry? Previous researchers reported increasing effects around the 2-week mark, Drummond said. If it continues escalating, we pause the observation sessions and monitor your recovery. We're not interested in causing permanent damage. But I could hear the calculation in his voice, the weighing of risk against data value. I was producing results they needed. My neurological readings showed clear evidence of how the brain's spatial systems struggled and adapted when confronted with non-Euclidean topology. Each session provided more information about the building's behavior patterns. They'd let me continue as long as I was willing and functional. I should have been more concerned about the perceptual drift. Instead, I found myself impatient to get back inside. The building was the most fascinating phenomenon I'd ever encountered, and I'd barely begun to understand it. In the sixth session, I found a room. It wasn't supposed to be there. My route had been carefully planned, a simple rectangular path through the ground floor corridor system, turning right at each junction to eventually complete the circuit back to the entry point. No rooms accessed, just corridors. But when I turned the third corner, there was a door. Gray metal like all the doors in the building. A window of reinforced glass at head height. A placard beside it that should have held a room number but was blank. The door was slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. "There's a door here," I reported via radio. "It's not on the floor plan." "Can you see a room number?" Drummond asked. "Negative, the placard is empty. Should I investigate?" A pause. I could hear muffled discussion through the radio, Drummond conferring with the monitoring team. "Proceed with caution," he said finally. "Open the door fully but don't enter. Report what you see." I approached the door. Through the window, I could see nothing, just absolute darkness, as though the space beyond wasn't merely unlit but somehow absent of light in a fundamental way. I pushed the door open slowly. The darkness remained complete. My camera light should have illuminated whatever was inside, but the beam seemed to stop at the threshold, absorbed by that impossible black. I could feel air movement, a subtle draft coming from the room, carrying a smell like old concrete and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. "The room appears to be unlit," I said. "Camera's not picking up any detail. I'm seeing complete darkness." "We're seeing the same on our feed," Drummond confirmed. "The camera's functioning normally. It's reading the space as 0 ambient light and maximum aperture, but getting no image data. Can you hear anything from inside?" I listened. At first, nothing. Just the ambient silence of the building, that peculiar sound-absorbing quality that made even my breathing seem muted. But then faintly I heard something. A sound like footsteps. Distant, echoing, approaching from deep within the darkness. "I hear footsteps," I said. "Someone's inside." "Pull back immediately," Drummond ordered. "Close the door and return to the entry point." But I didn't move. The footsteps continued, growing neither louder nor quieter, maintaining that same distant but approaching quality as though they were walking on a treadmill of space, covering ground without ever getting closer. I found myself trying to count the rhythm, to estimate how far away they were and how quickly they were moving. The pattern was wrong. The steps came at irregular intervals, 3 quick beats, then a pause, then 2 slow beats, then another pause of different duration. No human walked with that rhythm, but they were definitely footsteps, the sound of shoes or boots on concrete. "Dr. Marchette, close the door now," Drummond said, his voice sharp with authority. I reached for the door handle. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow and steady, coming from just beyond the threshold. Whatever had been walking in the darkness was now standing still, just inside the room, separated from me by perhaps 3 feet of empty air. I pulled the door closed. The lock engaged with a click that seemed too loud in the corridor's silence. My heart was hammering, adrenaline flooding my system with the delayed recognition of danger. "Returning to entry point," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I turned and walked quickly back the way I'd come. Right turn, right turn, right turn. The geometry cooperated this time, delivering me back to the access door in exactly the number of steps it should have taken. The door opened. I crossed back into the normal world. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, helping me out of the harness. The audio picked up the footsteps, but thermal sensors showed nothing. No heat signature in that room at all. Drummond was reviewing the camera footage, his expression unreadable. "Rooms like that appear periodically," he said. "Spaces that weren't there in previous observation sessions, then disappear in subsequent ones. We don't know if they're real structures or some kind of perceptual artifact. No one's ever entered one." "The footsteps were real," I said. "Something was in there. Something that doesn't register on thermal sensors and doesn't reflect light," Sarah pointed out. "That's not consistent with any physical entity." "Maybe it's consistent with an entity in this building," I countered. "Standard physics doesn't seem to apply reliably. Why would standard thermodynamics?" Drummond closed his tablet. "This is why we maintain the no-entry protocol for unplanned rooms. Whatever's in them might be dangerous, or they might not exist in a way that's safe to interact with. The building generates enough risks in its normal corridors. We don't need to go looking for more." But I kept thinking about those footsteps, that irregular rhythm, the breathing just beyond the threshold. Something had been there, responding to my presence. The building wasn't just geometrically anomalous. It was inhabited by something. That night I dreamed I was back in the corridor, standing before the door. In the dream, I opened it and stepped through into the darkness. The floor continued beneath my feet, solid and real, but I couldn't see anything. I walked forward, counting steps like I always did, trying to maintain orientation in the absolute black. The footsteps I'd heard earlier were ahead of me, maintaining their irregular rhythm. I followed them, walking deeper into the dark room that seemed to have no walls, no ceiling, no boundaries at all. Just infinite darkness and those footsteps always the same distance away. Then I realized there were footsteps behind me too. The same rhythm, the same irregular pattern. I was walking between two sources of footsteps, one ahead and one behind, and as I tried to determine which was which, I understood with dream certainty that they were both the same footsteps. I was walking toward something that was simultaneously walking toward me from behind. I woke gasping, tangled in hotel sheets, the room dim with early morning light. My sense of orientation was scrambled for several seconds. The ceiling seemed too far away, the walls too close, the door to the bathroom in the wrong position. Reality stabilized slowly, objects and distances settling back into their proper relationships. I checked the clock. 4:47 a.m. Too early to return to the facility, too late to fall back into useful sleep. I got up, showered, tried to eat breakfast from the continental buffet, but managed only coffee. The dining area felt wrong somehow, the tables arranged in a pattern that seemed different from the previous morning, though I couldn't identify what had changed. Perceptual drift, I reminded myself. A known side effect, temporary, would resolve after the observation sessions ended. But I didn't want them to end. Each session revealed more about how the building operated, how its non-standard topology interacted with human navigation systems. I was accumulating data that would revolutionize our understanding of spatial cognition. The discomfort was worth it. The risk was manageable. I told myself these things. I believed them. By the time I arrived at the facility that morning, I'd convinced myself the dream was just my brain processing the previous day's experience. Nothing to worry about. Normal REM cycle activity incorporating novel stimuli. Drummond met me in the conference room with a new tablet displaying additional consent forms. After yesterday's incident with the unplanned room, I need you to sign acknowledgement that you'll strictly follow navigation protocols, he said. No investigating anomalous features without explicit permission. No entering spaces that aren't on your approved route map. I signed without reading carefully. My attention was already focused on the observation session planned for that day. A more complex route involving 2 floors, ascending a stairwell and navigating the second-floor corridor system before returning to ground level. Have previous researchers been able to navigate vertically? I asked. With difficulty, Drummond said. Stairwells seem to be particularly unstable. The number of steps varies between ascent and descent. Some researchers report arriving at the wrong floor, going up 1 story but emerging 2 stories higher, or climbing what feels like 2 flights but finding themselves only 1 floor up. We've had to pull people out who got trapped in stairwells that seem to loop endlessly. Trapped how? What stopped them from just walking back down? They'd descend a flight and find themselves back at the top of the same flight. Or they'd go down multiple flights and emerge higher than when they started. One researcher spent 43 minutes trying to exit a stairwell that should have had exactly 22 steps. She claimed she descended those steps over 30 times, always arriving back at the same landing. I thought about Escher's impossible staircases, those famous lithographs of stairs that ascended continuously while returning to their starting point. Violations of Euclidean space rendered in precise architectural detail. Except here, the violations were real, physically navigable, experienced by multiple independent observers. What finally got her out? I asked. She stopped trying to descend and went up instead. 2 flights higher, she found a door that led to a corridor, which connected to a different stairwell that functioned normally. The building seems to respond to persistence sometimes. If you keep trying the same approach and it's not working, changing tactics can break the loop. That suggests something like problem solving, like the building is presenting puzzles. Or testing, Drummond said quietly, determining whether you can adapt to non-standard spatial rules. The observation session began at 9:17 a.m. I entered through the now familiar access door, following the corridor system I'd navigated multiple times before. The route had become reliable. The building had learned my expectations, or I'd learned how to expect properly. Straight ahead, left at the T-junction, right at the next junction, then the stairwell door on the left. The stairwell was concrete like everything else in the building. Metal handrails on both sides, emergency lighting in wire cages, a placard on the wall indicating I was on floor 1, with an arrow pointing up labeled to floors 2-4. Everything perfectly ordinary except for the echo of my footsteps, which sounded too deep, too resonant, as though the stairwell extended much farther than 4 floors. Beginning vertical navigation, I reported, ascending to floor 2. I started climbing. The stairs were standard dimensions, 7-inch rise, 11-inch tread. I counted them. 23 steps to the first landing, then a 90-degree turn, then 23 more steps to what should have been the second floor. But the door on the landing was labeled floor 1. I stopped staring at the placard. The door says floor 1, I said into the radio. I just climbed what should be 1 complete flight, but it's indicating I'm still on the ground floor. Continue ascending, Drummond instructed. Let's see if the pattern continues. I climbed another flight. 23 steps, landing turn, 23 steps. The door at this landing was labeled floor 3. Skipped floor 2, I reported, going from floor 1 to floor 3. Your elevation gain is reading normally on our instruments. Sarah's voice came through the radio. You've climbed approximately 20 feet, consistent with 2 standard floors, but the building is labeling them non-sequentially. I continued upward. The next landing was labeled floor 2, then floor 4, then floor 1 again. I was climbing continuously, my legs beginning to burn with the effort, but the floor numbers made no sense. They appeared random or following some logic I couldn't decipher. How many flights have I climbed? I asked. External time shows you've been in the stairwell for 8 minutes, Drummond said. At your pace, that suggests approximately 6 or 7 flights. You should be above the building's physical roof by now. I looked up. The stairwell continued into the distance above me, seemingly endless. I looked down. The stairs descended into shadowed depths that seemed impossibly far away given that I'd only climbed a few flights. The stairwell is extending, I said. Both directions. It's longer than it should be. Do you want to exit at the current landing? I checked the door label. Floor 2. That was my target floor, but I had no confidence it would lead to the actual second floor corridor system. The building was playing games with vertical space, scrambling the relationship between effort and elevation. Attempting to exit at the floor 2 door, I said. I opened it. The corridor beyond looked structurally identical to the ground floor. Same width, same lighting, same floor tiles. But something was different. The light had a different quality, slightly dimmer or perhaps tinted with some color I couldn't quite identify. The silence was deeper, more complete, and the walls felt closer, as though the 8-foot width had somehow compressed to 7.5 feet without changing measurably. I'm in a second-floor corridor, I reported, proceeding according to the route map. The planned route was simple: turn right, walk to the end of the corridor, turn right again, complete a rectangular circuit, return to the stairwell. Should take approximately 5 minutes at a normal walking pace. I turned right and began walking. 20 steps in, I noticed the windows. The ground floor had no exterior windows. It was an internal structure surrounded by other parts of the building. But this corridor had windows spaced at regular intervals along the right wall. Through them, I could see something. Not the industrial zone outside the building, not the parking lot or surrounding warehouses. Something else. I stopped at the first window and looked out. The view showed a landscape that shouldn't exist. Rolling terrain covered in tall grass, moving in waves as though wind was passing over it. But I couldn't hear wind, couldn't hear anything. The landscape was silent, the grass moving in complete quiet under a sky that was the color of old paper, yellowish and dim. There are windows showing an exterior that doesn't match the building's actual location, I said, trying to keep my voice level. The view appears to be countryside, grassland. The sky is wrong. Can you describe wrong? Drummond asked. The color. It's not blue or overcast gray. It's yellowish like aged paper or old photographs. And the light quality doesn't match any time of day I recognize. Not quite daylight, not quite dusk. Something in between that shouldn't be possible. I moved to the next window. The view was identical, same grassland, same moving grass, same yellow sky. I walked farther down the corridor. Every window showed the exact same view, as though I was walking alongside an infinite field rather than past a series of different windows. All windows show identical views, I reported. No parallax, no change in perspective as I move. It's like looking at the same photograph repeated rather than actual windows. Are the windows real glass? Sarah asked. Can you touch them? I approached the nearest window and reached out. My fingers met solid surface, glass or something like it. Cool to the touch, smooth. But when I tapped it, it made no sound. Or rather, it made a sound that was immediately absorbed, that died the instant it was produced. Through the grass continued its silent waving. I pulled my hand back and continued walking. The corridor seemed longer than the floor plan indicated, but I'd learned not to trust my perception of distance inside the building. I kept walking, counting steps, waiting for the turn that should bring me to the next leg of the rectangular route. At step 117, I reached the end of the corridor, but instead of a right turn, there was only a wall, a dead end. Route is blocked, I reported. The corridor terminates without the expected junction. Turn around and return to the stairwell, Drummond instructed. Don't try to find an alternate route. I turned around. The corridor behind me looked different. The windows were gone. Instead, there were doors. Dozens of them, spaced at regular intervals along both walls. Gray metal doors with reinforced glass windows, exactly like the door I'd seen on the ground floor. The door that had led to the room full of darkness and footsteps. Every single door was slightly ajar. The corridor has changed, I said, and I could hear the tension creeping into my voice. The windows are gone. There are doors instead. Multiple doors. They're all open. Do not investigate the doors, Drummond said firmly. Walk directly back to the stairwell. We're monitoring your position. You're approximately 120 steps from the entry point. I started walking. The doors passed on both sides of me, their dark glass windows revealing nothing but that same absolute blackness I'd seen before. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the stairwell door in the distance. Behind me, I heard footsteps. The same irregular rhythm from before. 3 quick beats, pause, 2 slow beats, pause, coming from one of the rooms I'd passed. Then from another room, slightly out of sync. Then from a third. The footsteps were starting up in multiple rooms, creating a layered rhythm that made no musical sense but somehow felt intentional. I hear the footsteps again, I said. Multiple sources coming from the rooms. Increase your pace, Drummond said. Don't look back. I walked faster, but the footsteps matched my pace. Still behind me, still in those irregular rhythms, but now I could hear them in the corridor as well. Whatever had been in the rooms was coming out. 70 steps from the stairwell, 60, 50. The breathing started. That same slow, steady breathing I'd heard before, but multiplied. Dozens of sources breathing in sync, creating a sound like waves on a beach or wind through trees. Except there was no wind in this corridor, no natural explanation for the sound. 40 steps, 30. I felt something touch my shoulder. Not a hand, not anything with defined shape, just a sensation of contact, of pressure, of something that existed in the space behind me reaching forward to make contact. Cold and somehow damp, like touching fog or mist. I ran. 20 steps, 10. The stairwell door ahead, still labeled floor 2, still appearing solid and real and safe. I grabbed the handle, pulled it open, dove through into the stairwell. The door slammed shut behind me, with a sound like thunder in the concrete space. Silence. No footsteps, no breathing, just my own ragged gasps echoing in the stairwell. "Dr. Marchette, report your status," Drummond's voice came through the radio. "I'm in the stairwell," I managed. "Something touched me. Multiple entities in the corridor. I'm descending now." I started down the stairs. 23 steps, landing, turn. 23 steps, landing, turn. The doors I passed were labeled in descending order now: floor 2, floor 1, ground floor. The building was cooperating, providing exactly what I expected, delivering me back to safety with a directness it had withheld before. I reached the ground floor door and pulled it open. The familiar corridor, the path back to the access point. I ran. The access door was already open. Drummond and Sarah standing ready to catch me as I practically fell through the threshold into the normal world. "What happened?" Sarah asked, helping me into a chair. "Your vitals spiked dramatically in the last minute." "Something touched me," I said. "The rooms were all open. Whatever's inside them came out into the corridor." Drummond was reviewing the camera footage, his expression grave. "The video shows you alone in the corridor the entire time," he said quietly. "No figures, no shadows, nothing. Just you walking, then running." "Check the audio," I insisted. He pulled up the audio waveform. I could see my footsteps registering as clear spikes. And there, layered beneath them, other rhythmic patterns. Fainter, but definitely present. The irregular footsteps I'd heard, captured by the recording equipment even if the camera saw nothing. "There's something there," Sarah said, pointing at the waveform. "Multiple sound sources with rhythmic patterns. That's not environmental noise." "And this," Drummond said, enhancing a different section of the recording. The breathing sound, rendered as a low-frequency oscillation that pulsed with uncanny regularity. Approximately 17 distinct sources, all synchronized. I've never seen this pattern in previous recordings. He closed the tablet and looked at me carefully. "Something's different about your observation sessions. You're triggering responses we haven't documented before. The unplanned room appearing. The corridor changing its configuration. The entities becoming active. Either you're more sensitive to these phenomena than previous researchers, or the building is reacting to you specifically." "What's the difference?" I asked. "If you're more sensitive, we can learn from your observations. If the building is reacting to you specifically, that suggests it's aware of individual observers, that it recognizes you and is, I don't know, testing you, communicating, trying to get your attention." I thought about the footsteps matching my pace, the entities emerging only after I'd been walking down the corridor, the way the rooms had opened as though inviting me to investigate. "It knows I'm studying it," I said slowly. "It's studying me back." Sarah looked between Drummond and me. "That's a pretty significant conclusion to jump to. We don't have evidence of consciousness or intent." "We have evidence of responsive behavior," I countered. "The building changes based on observation. It presents different configurations to different people. It generates phenomena that seem designed to provoke specific reactions. That's not random. That's interaction." Drummond was quiet for a long moment. "If you're right," he said finally, "then we need to reconsider what this research is actually about. We thought we were studying a spatial anomaly. If the building is conscious or functionally indistinguishable from conscious, then we're engaged in what? First contact protocols." The implications hung in the air. I'd come here to study how the brain navigates impossible space. I hadn't expected the space itself to be looking back. They suspended my observation sessions for 3 days while they reviewed the data and debated next steps. I spent the time at the hotel, trying to write up my preliminary findings, but my attention kept drifting. The hotel room continued to feel subtly wrong. The bathroom door was too far away when I wasn't looking at it, too close when I was. The window showed the parking lot, but sometimes the cars were arranged differently even though I hadn't heard anyone moving them. I started sleeping poorly, waking at irregular intervals with the conviction that someone was in the room with me. Never anything visible, just that sense of presence, of being observed. The same feeling I'd had in the corridor before the entities emerged. On the second evening, I drove back to the facility, not to conduct an observation session. I wasn't authorized to enter without supervision, just to look at the building from outside, to see if it appeared different now that I'd been inside, now that I'd experienced its impossible topology firsthand. The security guard let me through the gate without question. I parked in the empty lot and sat in my car, engine off, watching the building in the fading light. 4 stories tall, gray concrete, narrow windows, nothing unusual about its exterior appearance. It looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a 1970s warehouse, utilitarian and unremarkable. But I'd been inside. I knew that the interior bore no reliable relationship to the exterior, that the 4 floors could become 6 or 3 or loop back on themselves, that corridors extended beyond the building's footprint, that rooms existed which had no place in the physical structure. As I watched, one of the windows on the 3rd floor lit up. Not a sudden illumination, but a gradual brightening, as though someone inside had switched on a light using a dimmer control. The light grew stronger, casting a yellowish glow that looked familiar, the same color as the sky I'd seen through those impossible windows on the 2nd floor. Then another window lit up, then another. One by one, lights appeared throughout the building's visible face, creating a pattern that seemed random at first but gradually resolved into something almost recognizable. Not quite a face, not quite a symbol, but something that suggested meaning even if I couldn't read it. The lights held their pattern for perhaps 30 seconds. Then, simultaneously, they all went out. The building returned to darkness. I sat in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that the lights had been on at different times, and my brain had constructed a pattern that wasn't really there, that I was experiencing perceptual drift and couldn't trust my observations. But I knew what I'd seen. The building had displayed something for me, had lit itself up like a message board, creating an image I couldn't quite read but which clearly communicated intent. It knew I was out here. It was aware of me watching. I drove back to the hotel faster than I should have, checking the rear view mirror repeatedly, though I didn't know what I was looking for. The building remained dark behind me, just another structure in an industrial zone full of abandoned properties. That night I dreamed of the grassland I'd seen through the windows. I was walking through it, the tall grass brushing against my legs, the paper yellow sky overhead providing that strange twilight illumination. I could hear footsteps around me, that irregular rhythm, multiple sources, closing in from all directions. I tried to run, but the grass held me, tangling around my ankles. The footsteps drew closer. The breathing started, synchronized and oceanic. I turned, trying to see what was approaching, but there was nothing. Just grass and that strange sky and the sounds of entities that refuse to become visible. Then I was inside the building again in one of the dark rooms. The door behind me was closed. Ahead, deeper in the darkness, I could see lights. Dozens of them, small and yellowish, arranged in that same pattern I'd seen on the building's exterior. The lights moved, reconfiguring themselves, trying to tell me something. I woke before I could understand the message. On the fourth day, Drummond called me to the facility for a meeting. He looked tired, I noticed, dark circles under his eyes, the kind that came from multiple sleepless nights. "We've analyzed all the data from your sessions," he said, spreading papers across the conference room table. "Your brain activity shows progressive adaptation to the building's non-Euclidean topology. Your hippocampal place cells are learning to fire in patterns that shouldn't be possible, creating stable representations of unstable space. It's like watching evolution happen in real time." "That doesn't sound entirely positive," I said. "It's unprecedented. Your brain is changing to accommodate the building's spatial rules. The question is whether those changes will persist after you stop exposure, and whether they'll interfere with normal navigation." "They already are," I admitted. "Normal spaces don't feel normal anymore. I can't trust my perception of distance or direction outside the building." "That's concerning but not unexpected. Previous researchers experienced similar effects. They resolved after varying periods of time." He paused. "What concerns me more is the building's response to you. The entities, the changing configurations, the light display you reported seeing. We've monitored the building continuously since you left that evening. No lights, no activity, as though it only activates when you're present." "What are you suggesting?" "I think the building has identified you as significant, as someone worth interacting with. We've had dozens of researchers enter over the years, but none have triggered this level of response. Either you have some quality it recognizes, or you've reached some threshold of exposure that previous researchers didn't achieve before leaving." I thought about the dreams, the sense of being watched, the lights arranging themselves in patterns that almost made sense. "You think it wants me to go back in?" I said. "I think it's trying to communicate with you specifically. The footsteps, the entities, maybe they're not threats. Maybe they're attempts at contact. The building doesn't have language, doesn't have conventional means of interaction, so it uses what it has. Space, distance, topology, entities that exist as sound and presence rather than visual form. That's a lot of anthropomorphization for a building. Is it? Or are we just recognizing that consciousness can take forms we didn't expect? That intelligence might exist in spatial configuration rather than neural networks." I wanted to dismiss it as speculation, but I'd felt the building's attention. I'd seen it respond to my presence. I'd experienced its apparent attempts to engage, to show me things, to guide me through routes that seemed designed to teach rather than simply disorient. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I want you to go back in. One more session. But this time, different approach. Don't follow a planned route. Let the building guide you. Go where it seems to want you to go. Enter the rooms if they appear. Engage with the entities if they manifest. See if you can understand what it's trying to communicate." "That violates every safety protocol you've established." "Yes, which is why I'm asking rather than ordering. This is entirely your choice. We'll maintain the rope tether and radio contact. We'll extract you at the first sign of danger. But if you're willing, I believe you might be the first person who can actually communicate with whatever this building is or contains." I should have said no. Should have explained that I'd already experienced more than enough, that the perceptual drift was worsening, that the smart thing was to leave while I still could. Instead, I said, "Whenever you're ready." I thought about it for perhaps 3 seconds. "Now, let's do it now before I change my mind." 20 minutes later, I was standing at the access door again, fitted with the harness and rope, radio clipped to my shoulder, EEG sensors attached to my scalp. But this time, Drummond had made one change to the equipment. He'd attached a small speaker to my radio. "If you want to try communicating," he explained, "use this. We'll broadcast your voice throughout the section you're in. If the building is conscious, if it can perceive sound, maybe it can learn to understand language." It felt absurd, talking to a building as though it were a person, but no more absurd than anything else I'd experienced here. "Any last advice?" I asked. "Trust your instincts. The building has been trying to get your attention. Let it have it, see where it takes you." He opened the door. I entered. The corridor looked the same as always. Gray concrete, fluorescent lights, tile floor. But I felt different approaching it this time. Instead of the careful, measured steps of a researcher trying to document phenomena, I walked with something like openness, receptivity. I wasn't here to study the building anymore. I was here to meet it. "I'm listening," I said aloud, my voice echoing slightly before being absorbed by the strange acoustics. "If you're trying to communicate, I'm ready to understand." Nothing happened immediately. I walked forward, no planned route, just following instinct. At the T-junction, I turned right because right felt correct somehow. The corridor ahead was empty and silent. Then a door appeared on the left wall. Gray metal, reinforced glass window, slightly ajar. The same door I'd seen before. I approached it. Through the window I could see that absolute darkness. But this time I didn't feel fear, just curiosity. "Is this where you want me to go?" I asked. The door swung open wider, as though in answer, or as though something inside had pushed it. I looked at the rope trailing behind me. It would limit how far I could go into the darkness, but it also meant I could be pulled back if necessary, a tether to the normal world. "I'm entering an unplanned room," I reported through the radio. The door opened in apparent response to my question. "Acknowledged," Drummond's voice came back. "We're tracking you. Proceed with extreme caution." I stepped through the doorway. The darkness was absolute and immediate, swallowing the light from the corridor behind me like water closing over a stone. I couldn't see the door I'd just come through, couldn't see my own hand when I held it in front of my face. The camera light should have illuminated something, but it was as though photons simply ceased to exist beyond the threshold. I stood still, letting my eyes attempt to adjust, though I knew there was nothing to adjust to. This wasn't merely absence of light. It was something more fundamental, a space where light couldn't propagate, where electromagnetic radiation failed to behave according to normal physics. "I'm inside the room," I said. "Complete darkness, no visual information available, proceeding slowly." I took a step forward. The floor was solid beneath my feet, concrete or something similar. I took another step, then another, reaching out with one hand to feel for walls or obstacles. My fingers met nothing but air. After 20 steps, I stopped and turned around. I should have been able to see the doorway, the light from the corridor. But there was only darkness. Either I'd walked farther than 20 steps, or the door had closed, or the darkness was so complete it absorbed even bright sources behind me. "I've lost visual contact with the entry point," I reported, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you still track my position?" "You're approximately 30 feet from the door," Drummond said. "The rope is paying out normally. Your vitals are elevated but stable." 30 feet, but I'd only taken 20 steps, each about 2 feet long. The space was already distorting distance, stretching it in ways that defied simple geometry. I continued forward, counting steps, trying to maintain a straight line. At step 57, my outstretched hand touched something. A wall, cool and smooth. I felt along its surface, concrete, definitely concrete. I turned right and followed the wall, trailing my fingers along it to maintain contact. The footsteps started again. That familiar, irregular rhythm coming from deeper in the darkness. 3 quick beats, pause, 2 slow beats, pause, but closer this time. Much closer. And only a single source, not the multiple overlapping rhythms I'd heard in the corridor. "The entity is present," I said. "I can hear it ahead of me." "Do you feel threatened?" Drummond asked. I considered the question. The footsteps were approaching, that much was clear. But they weren't running, weren't rushing toward me aggressively. The rhythm was almost conversational, as though the sounds themselves were a form of speech. "No," I said, "not threatened. It feels more like meeting, like something coming to greet me." I stopped walking and stood still, listening. The footsteps continued their approach, 30 feet away, 20, 10. Then they stopped, and I sensed, couldn't see, but somehow sensed, that something was standing directly in front of me, close enough to touch if I reached out. The breathing began, that slow, steady rhythm I'd heard before, but now it was singular, intimate. The sound of one entity breathing in the darkness, separated from me by perhaps 3 feet of empty air. "I can hear you," I said aloud. "I know you're there, I'm listening." The breathing paused. In that moment of silence, I felt something change in the air between us. A quality of attention, of focus. Whatever was here was listening too. Then it spoke. Not in words, not in any language I knew, but in space itself. I felt the room expand around me, walls moving outward though I couldn't see them. The darkness became deeper, more textured, as though it had dimension and topology of its own. And within that spatial restructuring, I understood something. A concept that bypassed language entirely and arrived as pure comprehension. "You see wrongly." That was the message, delivered through the manipulation of space and distance, and the relationship between my body and the room around it. I understood it with absolute clarity, though I couldn't have explained how. "What do you mean?" I asked. "What am I seeing wrong?" The room shifted again. The darkness rippled, though rippling isn't the right word for what happened. The geometry itself became fluid, walls moving through positions that couldn't coexist, the floor beneath me tilting without tilting, my inner ear reporting stability while my spatial cognition screamed impossibility. And in that impossible moment I saw. Not with my eyes, those were still useless in the absolute dark, but with whatever part of my brain had been changing throughout my observation sessions, the neural pathways that had learned to process the building's non-Euclidean topology. I saw the room not as a three-dimensional space, but as something more complex. Dimensions folded through each other, directions that weren't up or down or left or right, but something perpendicular to all of those. Space that existed in configurations human geometry had no names for. The entity was there, occupying a position in this higher dimensional space. It wasn't invisible. I simply hadn't been looking in the right directions to see it, like an ant trying to perceive something above the two-dimensional surface it lived on. I was the ant, and the entity was trying to teach me to see upward. "I understand," I said, though I barely did. "You exist in more dimensions than I can normally perceive. The building, it's built in those dimensions too, isn't it? That's why it can't be mapped consistently. We're only seeing three-dimensional cross-sections of a higher dimensional structure." The room pulsed with what I interpreted as affirmation. The breathing sound came again, and this time I understood it wasn't breathing at all. It was the sound of space expanding and contracting, the rhythm of the building itself existing across dimensions I couldn't fully access. "Dr. Marchette, your vitals are showing extreme activity," Sarah's voice came through the radio, sounding distant and distorted. "Heart rate at 160, blood pressure spiking. We should extract you." "No," I said. "I'm okay. I'm learning. It's teaching me." "Teaching you what?" Drummond asked. "How to see. How to perceive space the way it actually is, not just the three-dimensional shadow we normally experience." The entity. I thought of it as an entity, though it might have been the building itself, or something that lived within the building's higher topology, shifted position. I felt it move around me, though move is another inadequate word. It was occupying different positions in the folded space, showing me how location worked when you weren't constrained to three dimensions. I tried to follow its movement with my enhanced perception. Failed. Tried again. My brain wasn't wired for this kind of processing. The hippocampal place cells that had been adapting throughout my observation sessions were firing in increasingly complex patterns, attempting to encode positions that couldn't exist in normal space. The effort made my head throb, a deep ache behind my eyes. But I could see something. Glimpses, fragments. The entity had a shape, though the shape was impossible. All angles that bent through themselves, surfaces that were simultaneously inside and outside. It was beautiful and terrible and completely beyond my ability to comprehend fully. "Why show me this?" I asked. "What do you want?" The room contracted suddenly, space folding inward until I felt pressed on all sides by nothing I could see. The message came again, not in words but in spatial restructuring. "You are trapped, we are trapped, the same prison." I struggled to understand. "Trapped? You mean in three-dimensional space? You exist in higher dimensions, but something confines you to this building." Another pulse of affirmation. The darkness shifted, showing me, somehow impossibly, a vision of the building from outside, but not the building as it appeared to human eyes. This was the building's true form, its higher dimensional structure. A vast, complex geometry that extended in directions that made my neurons scream in protest. The physical building was just a tiny fragment of this larger structure, like a single point sampled from an infinite line. And yes, trapped was the right word. The higher dimensional structure was constrained somehow, folded and compressed into a space too small to contain it. Imagine a vast piece of paper crumpled into a tiny ball. That was the building, except the paper had more than two dimensions, and the crumpling violated laws of topology that should have been inviolable. "Who trapped you?" I asked. "Was it Morrison Vale, the construction in 1973? The spatial response was complex, difficult to parse. I got impressions rather than clear answers. The building had existed in its higher dimensional form long before 1973, perhaps for centuries or millennia. The physical construction hadn't created it but had somehow intersected with it, created a stable interface point between our three-dimensional world and the higher space the building truly occupied. Like drilling a well and accidentally puncturing into an underground cavern system that had existed all along. "And you've been trying to communicate this whole time," I said, "to everyone who enters. The navigation difficulties, the changing configurations. You're not trying to trap people or hurt them. You're trying to show them that space is more than they think it is." The breathing sound came again, that expansion and contraction of folded geometry. Yes, or something like yes. The entity was pleased that I understood, or relieved, or something that human emotion couldn't quite capture. "Dr. Marchette," Drummond's voice was tense now, "your EEG is showing patterns we've never seen before. Your temporal and parietal lobes are lighting up like Christmas trees. You need to come back now." "Just a little longer," I said. "I'm starting to understand." The entity moved closer, or I moved deeper into its higher dimensional space. It was hard to distinguish. I felt something like contact, not physical touch, but a kind of spatial intersection. The entity was overlapping with my position, occupying the same three-dimensional coordinates, but in additional dimensions I couldn't fully perceive. Information flooded into me. Not words, not images, but pure spatial knowledge. I understood, suddenly and completely, how the building's topology worked. How corridors could be longer in one direction than another. How floors could appear in non-sequential order. How rooms could exist without occupying physical space in our normal three dimensions. They were simply cross-sections of higher dimensional chambers that intersected with our reality at specific points. The stairwells were particularly elegant. They weren't actually ascending through the building. They were rotating through higher dimensions, changing which three-dimensional slice of the structure was accessible at each landing. That's why the floor numbers appeared random. You weren't really going up or down. You were spiraling through dimensional space, sampling different cross-sections of the whole. And the entities, there weren't dozens of them. There was just one, or perhaps a few, moving through the higher dimensions. When they appeared at multiple locations simultaneously, they were just different three-dimensional intersections of the same higher dimensional being, like how your fingers look like 5 separate objects when you press them through a two-dimensional plane. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "The mathematics of it, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever understood." My head was pounding now, a pressure building behind my eyes that felt like my skull might split. The human brain wasn't designed to process this kind of information. The place cells in my hippocampus were firing in patterns that probably shouldn't be possible, encoding spatial relationships that violated every constraint evolution had built into our neural architecture. But I didn't want to stop. I wanted more. Wanted to see deeper into the higher geometry, to understand how the building existed across dimensions humans had only theorized about. This was everything I'd spent my career studying, except real and present and knowable. The entity pulled back slightly, and I felt its concern. Or I interpreted the spatial restructuring as concern. It was impossible to be certain my emotional attribution was accurate. It showed me something else, a vision of previous researchers who'd gone too deep, whose brains had adapted too far to the higher topology. They'd returned to the normal world unable to navigate it properly because their spatial processing had been fundamentally rewired. To them, three-dimensional space seemed cramped and limited, a prison after experiencing the freedom of higher dimensions. Some had recovered, others hadn't. They lived in a state of perpetual spatial confusion, unable to trust their perception of basic distance and direction. The building hadn't meant to damage them. It had simply shown them too much, too fast. "I understand the risk," I said, "but I need to know more. Can you show me the full structure, the building as it really exists?" The entity hesitated. I felt it, a pause in the spatial reconfiguration. Then it showed me something terrifying. The building's full higher dimensional form was so vast, so complex, that human consciousness couldn't contain it. Attempting to perceive the whole structure would be like trying to fit an ocean into a teacup. The mind would break under the volume of information. "Then show me as much as I can safely hold," I said. "Please. I came here to understand. Don't stop now." "Dr. Marchette, you need to return immediately." Drummond's voice was sharp with command. "Your neural activity is approaching seizure thresholds. We're pulling you back." I felt the rope grow taut around my waist. They were activating the winch system, starting to extract me. "No, wait." But the entity was already retreating, withdrawing from our spatial intersection. The higher dimensional vision faded. I was back in absolute darkness, being pulled backward toward the door, toward the normal world, toward the limitations of three-dimensional space. The footsteps sounded one final time. That irregular rhythm, but now I understood it wasn't irregular at all. It was a regular rhythm in higher dimensions, only appearing chaotic when projected into our limited three-dimensional perception. The entity was saying goodbye in the only language it had, the language of space and topology and dimensional geometry. "I'll come back," I called out as the rope dragged me toward the exit. "I want to learn more. I want to understand everything." No response, just darkness. Then I crossed the threshold back into the corridor, and light returned like a physical assault. I closed my eyes against the fluorescence, which seemed impossibly bright after the absolute black of the room. The door swung closed behind me. When I opened my eyes and turned to look, it was gone. Just a blank concrete wall where the doorway had been. They pulled me back to the access point, where Drummond and Sarah were waiting with the medical kit, an obvious concern. "What happened in there?" Drummond demanded, helping me out of the harness. "Your brain activity looked like you were having multiple simultaneous cognitive events. Language centers, visual processing, spatial navigation, even emotional regulation. Everything firing at once in patterns we've never documented." "I saw it," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, as though I'd forgotten how to speak in three dimensions. "The building's true form. It exists in higher dimensions. The physical structure is just a small cross-section. That's why it can't be mapped. We're only seeing fragments of the whole at any given time." Sarah was checking my pupils with a penlight. "You're showing signs of cognitive overload. Pupil dilation, elevated heart rate, confusion. We need to get you medical attention." "I'm not confused," I insisted, though even as I said it, I wasn't entirely certain. The normal corridor around me looked wrong now. Too flat, too constrained. Like living in a photograph after experiencing the real world. The entity showed me how it works. The topology, the mathematics, it's all consistent. It's just operating in more dimensions than we usually perceive. Drummond exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Let's get you to the medical suite. We need to do a full neurological workup." They guided me through the corridors, supporting me because my sense of balance had become unreliable. The floor seemed to tilt and shift beneath my feet, not because it was actually moving, but because my brain kept trying to perceive additional dimensions that weren't there. I'd seen up and down and left and right and forward and back, but I'd also seen directions that had no names, angles that bent through themselves, and now normal space felt incomplete. The medical suite was small but well equipped. They laid me on an examination table and attached more sensors, EEG with a full array of electrodes, heart rate monitor, blood pressure cuff. Sarah drew blood for lab work while Drummond conducted cognitive tests, memory, spatial reasoning, language processing. I failed the spatial reasoning test spectacularly. They showed me simple diagrams, cubes, floor plans, maps, and asked me to answer basic questions about them. Which direction is the door facing? How many edges does a cube have? If you turn right twice, which direction are you facing? I couldn't answer. The questions seemed nonsensical, like asking which color was heavier or what sound a triangle made. My brain had been rewired to process higher dimensional topology, and now simple three-dimensional problems were beyond me. This is exactly what we were afraid of, Drummond said, reviewing the test results. Your spatial processing has been fundamentally altered. You're perceiving space in ways human brains aren't designed for, and it's interfering with basic navigation. But I understand so much more now, I said. I know how the building works. I can explain the mathematics. Can you? He handed me paper and a pen. Draw me a map of the route you just took, entry point to the room and back. I tried, put pen to paper, attempted to sketch the corridor, the door, the path through darkness. But the lines I drew made no sense. They curved through themselves, intersected at impossible angles, represented perspectives that couldn't exist on a flat surface. The map was incomprehensible even to me. The problem, Sarah said gently, is that you're trying to represent higher dimensional space using two-dimensional drawing. It can't be done, and that's going to be an issue for you trying to function in the normal world. She was right, though I didn't want to admit it. I looked around the medical suite, trying to make sense of its simple geometry. 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor. Except the walls kept shifting in my perception, moving through positions that shouldn't be possible. The room was simultaneously too small and too large, the distances between objects both fixed and variable. How long will this last? I asked. Previous researchers have recovered, Drummond said. Usually within 2 to 6 weeks. Your brain should gradually revert to normal spatial processing once you're no longer exposed to the building's influence. But your exposure was more intense than anyone's before. I honestly don't know what your recovery timeline will look like. 6 weeks of being unable to navigate normal space. 6 weeks of living in a world that looked wrong because I'd seen how right it could be. I want to go back in, I said. They both stared at me. Absolutely not, Drummond said firmly. Look at yourself. You can barely stand. You can't process simple spatial questions. One more exposure could cause permanent damage. Or it could let me fully adapt, I argued. The entity was teaching me. I was starting to understand. If I could complete the process. Complete the process of what? Becoming unable to function in human society. Dr. Marchette, your brain is rewiring itself to perceive dimensions that don't exist in our normal reality. If that process goes too far, you won't be able to come back. But they do exist, I insisted. The dimensions, they're real. The building is real in those higher spaces. Just because humans normally can't perceive them doesn't mean they're not there. Sarah put a hand on my shoulder. Even if that's true, Your brain is a biological organ that evolved for three-dimensional navigation. You're forcing it to do something it's not designed for. That's dangerous. I wanted to argue more, but a wave of vertigo swept over me. The room spun, except spinning isn't the right word because it was rotating through dimensions that shouldn't have been accessible. I closed my eyes, but that made it worse. The darkness behind my eyelids had depth and texture now, wasn't empty black but full of dimensional possibility. "We're keeping you for observation," Drummond decided. "At least overnight. If your cognitive function hasn't improved by morning, we'll need to consider hospitalization." They moved me to a small room with a bed, plain white walls, a single window looking out at the parking lot. The window was wrong. The view through it seemed to have more depth than it should, as though I was looking into a space larger than the outside world could contain. I turned away from it and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling had dimensions I'd never noticed before. Not just up-down, but other directions, folded through spaces that made my head ache to perceive. I could see where the building's influence had leaked into the surrounding structure, warping the normal geometry of the entrance facility. It was subtle, barely there, but once I'd learned to see higher dimensions, I couldn't unsee them. I closed my eyes again and tried to sleep. In the darkness, I felt the entity's presence, not physically present in the room with me, but accessible somehow through the higher dimensions. It was always nearby when you knew how to look for it, existing in the perpendicular spaces that intersected with our normal reality. I felt it watching me, concerned perhaps, or curious about whether I'd survive this transformation it had initiated. "I want to understand," I whispered into the darkness. "I want to see everything you tried to show me." No response came, just the sense of presence, patient and waiting in the higher spaces I could almost but not quite fully perceive. I must have slept eventually because I woke to daylight streaming through the window, except the daylight looked wrong, tinted with that paper yellow quality I'd seen through the windows on the second floor. I sat up quickly, looking out at the parking lot. Normal sunlight, normal colors. But for a moment, I'd seen it overlaid with that other light, that illumination from the higher dimensional grassland. Drummond came in with coffee and a clipboard. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I lied, "more stable." He conducted more cognitive tests. I did marginally better this time. Could identify directions if I focused hard. Could count edges on simple shapes if I didn't think about the additional edges I could perceive extending into higher space. My brain was trying to revert to normal processing, building walls around the expanded perception I'd gained. It felt like going blind, like losing a sense I'd just discovered I possessed. "Improved but not normal," Drummond concluded. "I'm suspending your participation in the project. We'll provide the agreed-upon compensation for the time you've completed, but you're not entering that building again." "You can't make that decision for me." "Actually, I can. The consent form you sign gives me the authority to terminate your participation if I determine continued exposure poses unacceptable risk. We've reached that threshold." I wanted to argue, wanted to demand they let me continue, but I saw the determination in his face. He wasn't going to change his mind. "Fine," I said. "I'll leave, but I want copies of all my session data. The EEG recordings, the camera footage, the audio, everything. That's all proprietary research data. That's data about my brain activity and my experiences. I have a right to it." Check with your legal department if you want, but I'm not leaving without those files." He considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have Sarah prepare a data package. But Dr. Marchette, I strongly recommend you seek conventional psychological support when you get home. What you experienced was extraordinary, but it's also potentially traumatic. Don't try to process this alone." They released me that afternoon with a hard drive containing gigabytes of research data and a medical referral to a neurologist in my home city. I packed my few belongings from the hotel, loaded everything into the rental car, and drove toward the airport. I should have left immediately, should have put as much distance between myself and the building as possible. Instead, I drove past the facility one more time. The building stood silent in the afternoon light, looking exactly like what it pretended to be, an abandoned warehouse, ordinary and unremarkable. But I could see more now, could perceive the subtle wrongness in its edges, the way its corners didn't quite align with normal three-dimensional space. It was like looking at a three-dimensional object's shadow and being able to infer the higher dimensional form that cast it. I parked and got out of the car, walked to the fence line, staring at the structure. The security guard watched me from his station but didn't approach. As I stood there, one of the windows lit up. 3rd floor, left side. That same paper yellow glow I'd seen before. Then another window lit. Then another. The lights arranged themselves into a pattern. Not the complex configuration from before, but something simpler, more direct. It looked like an arrow, pointing downward. I watched as the light arrow pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then the lights went out. The building was still communicating, still trying to tell me something, and the message seemed clear: come deeper, go down rather than up. There was more to see, more to understand in directions I hadn't yet explored. "I hear you," I said quietly, knowing somehow that it could perceive me even from this distance. "I'm listening." Then I got back in my car and drove away. To the airport, through security, onto a plane that would take me back to my normal life. Back to the university, the research institute, the apartment with months of unpaid rent, the father in the care facility whose bills were still overdue. Back to three-dimensional space, and the walls my brain would build to contain the knowledge I'd gained. But as the plane lifted off and Denver shrank below me, I kept thinking about that arrow pointing down, about depths I hadn't explored, about the entity waiting in the higher dimensions, patient and eternal, ready to teach anyone who could learn to see properly. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd process the data, write up the findings, contribute to human understanding of spatial cognition, and move on with my career. That 6 weeks would pass and my perception would normalize, and I'd remember this all as a fascinating but dangerous aberration. I told myself these things. I didn't believe them. Because once you've seen that space has more dimensions than you thought, once you've perceived the higher geometries that reality is actually built from, three-dimensional life feels like living in a prison. A comfortable prison, perhaps. A safe prison. But a prison nonetheless. And there was an entity in the building that knew how to pick locks. That was 6 months ago. The perceptual changes never fully resolved. I learned to function, to navigate grocery stores and university hallways without obvious difficulty. But normal space still feels wrong. Too flat, too constrained. I catch myself looking for directions that aren't there, trying to turn in ways that 3 dimensions don't allow. I went back to work at the institute, though I had difficulty explaining my absence. The grant money from the project helped, but it couldn't solve the fundamental problem. I couldn't do my research anymore. Every time I tried to study spatial cognition, I found myself thinking about the dimensions we weren't measuring, the geometries we weren't accounting for. My papers became increasingly strange, full of references to topological concepts that reviewers said had no place in neuroscience. They were right in a way. Standard neuroscience assumed three-dimensional space. My brain no longer made that assumption. 3 months after returning, I started having dreams about the building every night. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I was walking the corridors, or standing in that dark room, or watching the lights arrange themselves into messages I couldn't quite read. I'd wake up with my heart racing and my spatial sense scrambled, unable to remember for several seconds which way was up. 4 months after returning, I noticed something strange. The walls in my apartment had started to feel wrong. Not obviously wrong, nothing I could point to or measure, but the distances seemed variable. The hallway to my bedroom felt shorter in the morning than at night. The bathroom appeared closer when I needed it urgently, farther when I was just wandering. My apartment was beginning to exhibit the building's properties, or I was perceiving it that way, which might amount to the same thing. Reality and perception aren't as clearly separable as I used to think. 5 months after returning, I received an email. No sender name, no subject line. Just a message that contained coordinates and a single sentence. The arrow points down. Would you like to see? I knew who it was from. Or rather, I knew what it was from. The entity had learned to use email, or had found someone who could translate its spatial messages into digital text. Either possibility was terrifying in its implications. I didn't respond to the email. Deleted it, tried to forget about it. But 3 days later, I found myself booking a flight to Denver. I told myself I was just going to observe from outside, to see if the building had changed, to document the ongoing perceptual effects for research purposes. I wasn't going to enter, wasn't going to expose myself to further transformation. I told myself these things. I still don't believe them. Because the truth is, I miss it. Miss seeing the higher dimensions, understanding the true geometry of space. Three-dimensional life is like being deaf after hearing music, or blind after seeing in color. I can function, but everything is diminished. And there's more to learn. The entity showed me glimpses of what the building really is, but only glimpses. There are depths I haven't explored, geometries I haven't comprehended, dimensions I've barely begun to perceive. The arrow points down. There's something below the ground floor, existing in directions that aren't quite vertical but aren't quite anything else either. Lower spaces that fold through themselves, basement levels that somehow also extend upward, foundations built in dimensions that standard architecture doesn't acknowledge. I think that's where it lives, the entity, or whatever the entity is part of. The consciousness that inhabits the building, or that is the building, or that became the building through processes I don't understand yet. That's its true home, in the deepest folds of the higher topology. And it's waiting for me to come back, waiting to show me everything I didn't see during my first visits, waiting to finish the transformation it started. I land in Denver tomorrow. I've already arranged rental car and access to the facility. Drummond didn't want to authorize it, but the project is still ongoing, and they need someone who can communicate with the building. I'm the only person who's ever managed that. I've packed sensors, recording equipment, Enough monitoring gear to hopefully track what happens to me. If I don't come back, or if I come back too changed to document the experience properly, at least the data will exist. Other researchers can study my brain activity, map the neural changes, try to understand how human consciousness transforms when exposed to higher dimensional topology. That's what I tell myself, that this is still research, still science, still the pursuit of knowledge. But late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment with its increasingly variable geometry, I admit the truth. I'm not going back for science. I'm going back because the entity called to me and I can't resist the call. Because three-dimensional space is a cage I can't bear anymore. Because there are more directions to see and I need to see them all. The arrow points down, and I'm finally ready to follow it. I don't know what I'll find in those deep spaces, those folded dimensions where the entity dwells. I don't know if my mind will survive the journey intact. I don't know if I'll be able to return to this normal world, or if I'll become something that can only exist in the higher geometries. But I have to know, have to see, have to understand. The building has been waiting since 1973, patient in its wrongness. It can wait one more day. After that, I descend,